Welcome to part 2 of this logic tutorial on quantizing notes in MIDI. This is actually going to be part 2 of 3, because as I was putting the content for this video together, I realised I needed more time to cover what I wanted to cover. So this will carry over into a part 3. So in the last video we went over using the Quantize tool, and how to quantize a whole section of notes, as well as individual notes. In this video I'm going to be going a bit more in depth with this menu on the side here. And I was going to go into the strengthened swing sliders, but that will now go over into part 3. So over the course of part 2 and part 3, I'll explain why you might want to make changes here when it comes to quantizing your music. Now I'm going to be using this little section here to demonstrate these tools that we've got. I'll just play it quickly for you along with the click, just so you can hear how it's sounding. Now actually, before I move on to the tools on the left here, I'll show you something else you can do when it comes to quantizing, or even just editing notes in MIDI. So the first thing that I noticed there was that these notes on the one, so the notes on the first beat of the bar, are slightly off. So these ones here. And I'd say those notes are a little more important when it comes to having your music in time, as opposed to maybe other beats along the bar. And that's because you generally want to keep that pulse on the one pretty bang on. So beat 1 of the bar, you generally want that at least very close to being on time. Especially if it's the first beat of a whole new section. So let's say you're going into a chorus or a new verse. That moment of transition, you generally want that to be right on the money, or at least very close to. So something you might want to do is quantize just those notes. Let's just say you wanted to quantize certain notes only. So the way you do that is by holding down Shift and then clicking the notes that you want to quantize. And that's how to select specific multiple notes. And I can just quantize those notes if I want. Now, let's talk a bit about this menu here on the left-hand side. Now, this menu is somewhat related to what you can see on the grid here. So from 3 to 4, that's 1 bar. And you can see this bar is split up into 4 separate chunks here. So 4 quarters. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if we look at the first quarter, you can split that in half. So that would be 1/8 of a beat. You can split it up even further, so that there would be 1/16 of a beat. So 16 of those make up a whole bar. 8 of those make up a whole bar. 4 of those make up a whole bar, and that's half a bar. Those watching who know their basic music theory, you'll probably already know that, but yes, some may not. And this leads into the next section. So, depending on which option I click here, when I quantize something, it's going to snap to the closest point. So, if I did quarter note, it's going to snap to the closest quarter note. So the quarter notes there. If I pick an 8th note, it will snap to the closest 8th note. So you have to make sure you kind of pick the right option. An example of clicking the wrong option would be if I were to select this, so to snap to the closest whole beat. So let's see what happens when I do that. And that's completely messed up what I played in. So all of the notes there have snapped to the closest full bar. So to the 3 or 4. So just be aware which one you pick, because you can highlight a whole section of something, quantize it, and certain notes might snap to places where you don't necessarily want them to go. So the one that would work for this is snapping to every 8th note. So if I select 8th note here, and then quantize, so you can see that I quantized that. It was pretty much in time anyway. I'm just fine-tuning really. And that would work for the 16th note as well. Now I'm just going to undo what I've quantized, just so I can show you something else here. So I'm going to zoom in on this particular note here. Now notice what happens to this note when I quantize to the closest 32nd note. So where I should have hit this note was on this line here. So I hit it pretty early. Now if I quantize to the nearest 16th note, that will go there. So that will fix it. But if I do it to the closest 32nd note, and see what happens there, it actually shifts a bit to the left, because the closest 32nd note is to the left of the note. So it actually ends up being more out of time to what I actually want it to be. So just be aware of that when using the Quantize tool. So essentially just remember that the notes here will quantize to the nearest quarter note, 8th note, 16th note, etc. So I'll just quantize this bar. Hopefully that was somewhat clear. I appreciate I may not have explained it in the best way, but yeah, have a bit of a play around with it yourself as well, and you'll probably get used to working with it. I'm going to continue over in part 3, where I'll look more into the other options here, and I'll go over the strength and swing tools. I'll also talk a bit about human feel as opposed to something sounding quite robotic.